Can you, is that okay? Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And we are indeed a lab, a research group that specializes in community engaged research, but in the essence of what we do are collaborations. And so first, this collaboration with the School of Cities is very important to us. Also, this amazing collaboration and our community of students, because everything we do, every single thing you see and hear in not only today, but in our other projects is premised on the collaborations between our university community and the communities beyond us. And so that is really where I felt that the best way of doing this event today was to do it in our classroom, where we have students from environmental sciences, from urban studies, health studies, public policy and literature, comparative literature. And so that is the unique community skills that we bring to the table. Next slide, please. So how did the Feeding City Lab end up going with you to all these places across the globe, where we actually are collaborating with locally and globally resonant projects on food sovereignty and bringing in these voices from the food frontlines? I like to tell people it's one of the few good things that came out of the pandemic in 2020, when we were all forced to explore different forms of technology and outreach of knowledge creation, knowledge production, knowledge sharing, knowledge dissemination. And that is where we started with a project called Feeding the City, Pandemic and Beyond, which reached out to and did research about, in fact, many of the wonderful community voices and stakeholders who are represented in the 13 podcasts that we have released so far. We also did apply for different forms of funding, notably from the Social Science Humanities Research Council, but also from other groups, including the School of Cities, through the 4 years that we've been active. And shout out to Emma behind me, who created this map. And so these are the different places where we now are, in fact, collaborating to bring you voices, not just the voices that you're hearing, but voices really from 4 continents. So I'm going to now turn to Jackie to tell us how is it that we have not just the research that we've done from the University of Toronto, from our partners at different institutions in the city, including Toronto Metropolitan University, but also beyond, from New York University and University of Manchester, who were our partners, and of course, with our wonderful students from Trinity College and other units at the U of T and other institutions in this city. Thank you. Over to Jackie.
Thank you, Joe, and my thanks to the School of Cities for hosting us today. It's a pleasure to be here. When I first started working with the Feeding City project, it was still a project back in summer of 2020. And over that time, we were documenting the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on Toronto's food system, and particularly on local communities, and building partnerships, community partnerships, all of which we had to do remotely at that time. We were all working remotely. There were still closures, widespread closures. And so one of the key challenges we had as researchers is, how are we going to foster these relationships and support local communities under these circumstances? One of the ways we did that was through the podcast. That's how it first came about. So we developed several grants, as Joe mentioned, grant applications. Some of them were successful. We were partnering with colleagues in Manchester and UK and in New York City at the time, who were also doing research on the impact of COVID on their local food systems in those cities. And then we wanted to take it to the next level, because we were hearing all of these stories, and we were wanting to ensure that these stories were documented and archived, and also amplified for broader public in terms of the challenges and the barriers faced, and the lessons learned, and the hopes and aspirations for the future. So that's how this project came about. And since then, as I'll talk later in the presentation, it's evolved into a multi-series podcast, and we have multiple episodes in production right now. So we will be continuing the podcast. But when it first started, it was called Voices from the Food Frontlines, Pandemic and Beyond. And I'll be speaking mainly to that first series today. And then later on, I'll give you a peek into what's coming up next. So some key terms that we're working with here, since we all come from probably different disciplines and different fields, food security and food sovereignty are really at the core of this project. When we're thinking about food security, when we're looking at food security, we're looking at a community's access to food that is nutritious, delicious, affordable, accessible, and culturally appropriate. And food sovereignty is the knowledge and power of a community to determine and shape their food system to help bring this about. Voices from the Food Frontlines is focused on helping to build sustainable and resilient food systems. So we're looking specifically at small food producers across the network, farmers, growers, makers, cooks, vendors, distributors, markets, food banks, eaters, and consumers, and the relationships between them. So we really want to prioritize the human dimensions of food systems, how people relate to one another and their environment, combining the ecological and the social, learning the barriers and challenges, and also the potential, the innovations, the aspirations, the hopes to transform the system into one that is sustainable and also can withstand shocks, in this case, the shock of the pandemic on local supply chains. So we're interested in short food supply chains and building this network of multiple community stakeholders. And then just a note about community engaged research. Since we've developed from a project into a lab, we've developed several projects that have community engaged research at their core as a methodology, but there's different ways to go about this. And even at the lab, we've done this in different ways where we've aligned or partnered with, for example, an organization or a municipality to find out answers to one particular research question through qualitative research and interviews in the fields. So we have done that, and that was obviously more challenging to do, of course, during the pandemic itself and during the lockdowns. And so, as I mentioned, the Voices from the Food Frontlines podcast series really came about as a way of developing a community engaged research initiative and building those relationships in the community network to disseminate knowledge directly from the grassroots actors who were helping to ensure that their communities were fed. And this is reflected in the title of the series, Voices from the Food Frontlines. So just a couple of words about the series itself and then the approach, and then I'll take you into the series. This is the general series description. We started with Voices from the Food Frontlines, Pandemic and Beyond. We are just launching our new series. The first episode, episode 13, dropped yesterday. So it's now available online from the Sustainable Foodways series. But we really started with Voices from the Food Frontlines and then built out from there. So why podcast? And a little bit more about the approach. Specifically for researchers, scholars, and using podcasting as a tool for public scholarship. There are multiple different reasons or rationales why one might use a podcast in an academic project. Obviously, knowledge mobilization and public research communication are core to that, but why specifically podcasting? Why did we choose podcasting? So we have at our core the notion that podcasting is a form of storytelling with sound, and we needed to have a clear goal to guide the project in terms of what form of media or multimedia we might use. And so we really wanted to document the stories with our community collaborators, build an archive, as well as use podcasting as a tool for advocacy and change. And all at the core of all of this is relationship building with the different community collaborators that we feature, as well as building connections between them globally. And we're increasingly doing that as well. We can speak to that more at the end. So some examples of podcasting and public scholarship projects that maybe you're familiar with or maybe you're not, but we looked at as models when we were launching this project and designing how are we going to actually do this and carry this out. So our podcast is an interview-based podcast where we speak with grassroots actors who were working in different places and spaces within the food system in their communities during the COVID emergency. But of course, there's many different models. So while I'm speaking, please feel free to scan the QR code if you have a phone. It will bring you to a Jamboard, and you're welcome to share some of your favorite podcasts specifically for researchers, but any kind of podcast on our Jamboard. And you'll see, we always learn from each other, learning different models and tools. If you click to the second page, you can see a Jamboard we did for a podcast training workshop last month at Trinity College and some of the responses that came out of there. And there is now an increasing body of scholarship around podcasting and community engagement specifically within the university. And so I just wanted to acknowledge these key sources that were really helpful for us as we designed this project and figured out how to move from research to kind of a multimedia public communication platform. Specifically, the Humanities Podcast Network is an excellent tool if anybody is thinking about exploring this further for their own work. Okay, so to voices in the food frontlines, back to 2020 when we were just carving out this project. These are some common headlines that we were finding in the media at the time. And we were interested in kind of documenting what was going on the ground in response to a lot of the challenges that were being featured in the media. I'd like to just share with you a couple of snapshots from the podcast itself. And this will, I think, give you a better sense of kind of what we were doing and some of the insights that came out of it. So I'll just preview a couple of episodes for you to kind of help paint the arc of the series. So the series launched with a feature on the Malvern Urban Farm here in Scarborough. This is Claire Pertula. We did an interview with Claire Pertula about the launch of the urban farm, which actually was in preparation, I think, during COVID, but it launched after the COVID-19 pandemic. But it was a project that was, in the pipelines for a while and just launching as we were emerging from the pandemic. And they, as Claire explains, were reusing or repurposing a hydro corridor for not only a farm, but also a market garden for vendors within the community. So I'll just share with you a few words that Claire shared with us out of the broader series.
Through all of our programs, making sure that all participants, anyone who comes by the center can access food, can get some emergency food, and that we're also doing more advocacy to lessen the need for emergency food. But that's not all being done through the farm. now is the plan. So that's cool that we're kind of trying to we're taking that next step of integrating food into everything instead of keeping it a separate department, which I think is really important because like not everybody wants to grow food. That's not like physically growing and then pulling your own carrot is not the only way to get involved in food or to access food. So it's great that we've had this opportunity now, I guess, because of the pandemic and because of all these new funding sources that are coming up, to be able to kind of re-envision how we talk about food and how we work towards food justice as an agency.
That segues perfectly into my next question, which is about looking ahead and projecting into the future. So as someone who has extensive experience working in sustainable agriculture, perhaps food policy, you mentioned you've thought about and are interested in, and obviously you've done a lot of work in urban farming, what lessons do you carry forward in terms of building sustainable food futures in a city like Toronto, and maybe particularly in Scarborough, and what do you envision that future to look like?
That's a great question. I think one part of that sustainable food future is just giving more people the opportunity to kind of engage with food in one way or another. Obviously, I don't think Toronto is going to.
Okay. I'll let you tune into Claire's episode to hear what else she has to say on that. But I just wanted to highlight here some core themes, which was access to space in the city, to grow food, and the possibility of repurposing underused urban spaces. This was a key theme that came up in many of the interviews that we did, and as well as many of the interactions with different grassroots organizations, not only across Toronto, but also globally. So to contrast or complement with what we heard from Claire, I will next just draw your attention to an interview that we did with a market garden in Manchester, UK, to hear a little bit about some of their experiences. And we're hearing from Sam Payne from the Manchester Urban Diggers in Manchester, UK.
So I basically had to work, or else I would have had nothing. So yeah, we just absolutely was working like all the time and growing food. And we started selling food from the front gate, people, and advertising that. People really enjoyed coming down and getting their food shop because they felt a lot safer than going to supermarkets. They were outside, and we were selling them literally just over a little trestle table, and it was really popular. And it really just took off. Like we had people queuing down the fence, 20, 30, 40 people queuing to come and get veg from us. And we had to put these flags so that it could space people out to make sure. We decided to sell like coffee and cake and as a bit of an income sort of booster. So it was like, at one point, it was people's like day out of the week. They were allowed to go and get the groceries because it was, they had to, but they also, on the way there, they could walk through the park, take the long way. They could walk there, they could get a coffee and cake. And I think it was a real like sort of nice experience for some people that might have been sort of locked up inside the house for the rest of the week. So people really sort of got on board, and our popularity grew a lot. Like I say, we had loads more volunteers. If anything, when it all sort of started to come back to normal, that was more of a bumpy moment for us because there was all the other cafes started opening up, all the other shops. People sort of decided, it's a bit more safe to go into supermarkets. So all these sort of competitors, or what you call them, people started going to different places. So in a way, we had to adjust quite quickly after that moment, because we were like, oh right, this is real life, and we're not actually that popular. People are going elsewhere, and so we really had to adapt quite quickly for the past 2 or 3 years, changing what we do, applying for grants, doing this, that, and the other. So it's been a bit of a blur the last few years.
Yeah, despite all of the challenges posed by the pandemic, it's interesting to see that, the fact that, people are valuing their time outside and valuing social relations to their community more, that could be actually really great for.
Okay, I'll leave that interview there. Sam goes on to discuss the challenges that they encountered as a garden that was not classified as an essential service. So it limited their funding and their ability to survive. So a lot of their ability to sustain themselves was actually funded through the operation itself. And this is something that we've seen certainly in markets across the city of Toronto early in the pandemic, and then in other spaces, which was the question of classification. What's considered essential or not determined, eligibility for funding, and also even, whether or not they were able to stay open in the early months of the pandemic. So this was a challenge that several of our collaborators encountered. I'd like to share with you two more before we move on very briefly. Here, back to Toronto. So this is just a clip from Brian Joyce, who is at the Centre for Immigrant and Community Services based in Scarborough, explaining a little bit of the programming that they did and the pivots that they undertook in order to ensure that their clients and local community was accessing food throughout the pandemic.
The interesting thing is, shortly after COVID started and Daily Bread Food Bank were unable to deliver the same type of program they were in servicing the community with food, they started using satellites for delivery. And so what was happening is our local library, the Asian Court Library, was actually distributing food hampers into the Asian Court community. However, when the city decided they were going to reopen the libraries, Daily Bread was looking for another organization that could take on that role. It was considered to be a pop-up food bank. So it was supposed to be an 8 to 9 week endeavor, and we thought, you know what, we were not able to deliver what we could do before, so let's at least try and serve the community this way. And so we started working with Daily Bread. We started to refine our process of how we're going to do this during COVID, and we thought, we can do it outside over the next 8 to 9 weeks. However, quickly it became apparent that they would like us to become more full-time with the food bank. So we had to take on a number of different directions on how do we create space in the wintertime, because we weren't going to be able to do this outside again. So we actually had to do a whole remodeling of our warehouse and bring in some infrastructure to help, keep people safe during COVID, but also trying to serve the population. So, and then we started seeing quite a diversity of clientele that were coming in. So the food bank and the community garden were sort of the first pieces of it all. We realized that there just wasn't always enough food for everyone. And so the federal government came up with a grant opportunity called the Local Food Infrastructure Fund that we applied to increase our capacity to provide food by building a greenhouse. And so our greenhouse now has technically been in operation for the last year, but this has really been the first year we've really been able to maximize its use. And so what it's doing is allowing us to grow more food. Now the community garden has taken a focus that the food that's being grown now goes to the food bank. So we're able to provide fresh organic food for our food bank participants that they might actually see either in a grocery store or unable to be provided by the Daily Bread Food Bank because it's just not part of their list of foods. So then we try to look at how we become more culturally specific and looking at the foods that we grow that may be more appealing to people who are coming from outside of Canada and may not have access to it. So that was kind of then turning those two pieces in together. So now our greenhouse actually helps to grow seedlings. We harvest our seeds and we distribute that into the community through our seed library. And then more recently, we received a grant from Federal Development Ontario that allowed us to build 48 raised garden beds that we've now lent to the community as well as community organizations, and creating the ability for them to grow their own food. So that's kind of taken another step. We are starting now to work more in the kitchen now that our restrictions have started to lift. So we're holding a number of different cooking workshops for the community, and we want to be able to utilize some of the food that we're growing in our garden into our programming as well.
So Brian describes really a collective of programs that their organization runs to ensure food security that is tightly integrated into social health and well-being within the community. So food is at the core of it, but it really goes beyond experiences of food in and of itself to connect people within the community. And he talked later in the episode about earlier in the episode about a partnership with the libraries and the Daily Bread Food Bank, and we have another perspective on that later in the series with somebody at the Daily Bread Food Bank that we spoke to, that we've been collaborating with through the Scarborough Food Network. So the series itself is as it evolves, we're sometimes getting different people's perspectives on the same kind of phenomena or service or program that was provided, which is really interesting. And Brian also goes on to explain partnerships with a partnership with a local restaurant, a small food enterprise that they built during the pandemic to help ensure that local seniors, many of whom were newcomers or immigrants, could access prepared meals regularly throughout the pandemic. So we see this kind of evolution of a network of supports. And then the final episode that I'd like to just spotlight for you here before we kind of wrap up is episode 11. Another perspective on farmers markets and community. This one coming to us from Rio de Janeiro, with an interview with Tiago Gomid Nasser, who runs Juna Local, which is a collective of market vendors who were provisioning the local markets and communities during the pandemic. And it really, they've been working on this collective for about 10 years. And in this clip, he describes the pivots that they had to make during this time.
So we pivoted really quickly from doing pickup spots to door deliveries, which was a nightmare. All of a sudden, and the orders, they increased like tenfold in the matter of a couple of weeks. And we were not in the delivery business and the technology business. We're in the food business, but we had to learn quickly. So, how do you deliver eggs without not letting them get broken? We had to move in. We didn't have a space to do this because everything, we receive things, check everything, and people would go to the pickup spots. And all of a sudden we're processing a lot more orders. People need to store things with us. So it was crazy. We moved into a church for a while, and then to a kombucha factory until we eventually got our own warehouse. And but there were a few moments that we realized, how important community was, because people stuck with us during that time, and we started doing online meetings. And all our assemblies and meetings in the beginning, you had to be there. But it was interesting because we started using online tools a lot more efficiently, and the farmers could be there, so that was rewarding. And also, it was really important for the farmers because many of them could not go to the markets. And like one of those moments was when one farmer went for delivery. Everyone had the masks on, the astronaut gear, lots of everyone high on all the sanitizers, and she just said, "Thank you very much. If it weren't for the platform and for the work that we are doing together, I'd have to fire some of my collaborators and workers. I would probably just have to stop farming." So that was one of those moments that you say, okay, so this we'll keep doing this. This is
We often get the question, and I do want to open it up to questions soon. I know Joe may have a few more things to add, but we also get the question of how did we do this? So I really wanted to credit our wonderful team of RAs, as well as our global research collaborators who would, well, first of all, the research collaborators would often connect us with local organizations in their cities who were doing similar work or work that was complementary to the questions that we were asking here in Toronto. And I especially want to credit our wonderful team of RAs. This is a snapshot of our team from the winter 2024 session: Daphne, Jaclyn, Rhea, and Emma, who are, they've worked on some episodes from the series you just heard, but they're helping us to produce the episodes that are forthcoming in our next series, Sustainable Foodways, where we're expanding our geographic reach. We have an episode that we've just published, as I mentioned yesterday, in Kerala, South India, looking at the efforts and the connection between environmental conservation and sustainable food production amongst small farmers in South India. We have a couple other episodes that are coming up from India, and as well as Ghana, Lima, and Mexico. So there'll be a lot more that's coming up as we move past the pandemic phase and look at how we can help support grassroots actors and community organizations in building short food supply chains and relationships with community that are sustainable and resilient and equitable and just. So I'll just leave you with the final slide here. If you're interested in subscribing, we're on Podbean and Spotify. We're expanding distribution to other platforms as well to get the voices out there and to expand our reach. I'm not going to play the new series trailer because it is online, but definitely if you're interested in learning more about it, please do seek us out and give it a listen. And Joe, I'm going to pass it back to you because I know there were some questions as well that we wanted to make sure we had time to address.
Thanks, Jackie. In fact, I just want to put in a couple more thanks. First, a big shout out to Dr. Filippo Oncini, because it is through his research from the University of Manchester's Sustainable Consumption Institute that we were first connected with Manchester Urban Diggers and the other networks in the UK, and which is again a wonderful example of the collaboration and teamwork, not just across institutions and countries, but also across disciplines, because Filippo is a sociologist and a scholar of sustainability and food through that angle. And in fact, he is now in Germany. So, it is again an example of how we can actually take academic research within the kind of constituent specializations we are in to a whole new level through these public means of knowledge dissemination. The other shout out I want to give is to our former postdocs, Brian Dale at Bishop's University in Quebec now, and Noah Allison, who is in California, because they were also extremely instrumental in both getting us the funding as well as keeping the lab and associated research and community connections going. And last but not least, our other wonderful graduated alumni, Serena Wan, whose voice you heard, but also Adam Bishop, who again was extremely important. And that is the other aspect of co-creation of knowledge. Not just collaborations, but also co-creation of knowledge. And I think that is somewhere where we are so grateful to the School of Cities for this Knowledge Café itself is an example of how we can together think about co-creation, but also co-crediting of knowledge, as it were, which is very important, especially when we deal with community-based knowledge and other non-conventional forms of knowledge. And indeed, think about how we can decolonize the university and decolonize the forms of knowledge that are seen as legitimate or valorized above others. But that might be a good point to actually go to the questions. Jackie, if you wanted to read read out the questions that we've received so far, and I don't know if any others have come in, but I am looking at the chat, so.
I think Nora will send us some questions. Is that right?
Okay.
Yeah, we can ask them to you. Before we get to the questions we've written down, we just wanted to know, is anyone on the call right now have a question to ask? Feel free to just raise your virtual hand and we'll get to those questions first. So. Yes, Ekta, go ahead, please.
Hi there, can you hear me? Okay, perfect. Thank you. Just been having some tech glitches, so I thought I'd check. Thank you for the presentation. I'm very intrigued and will be subscribing to the podcast. So thank you for that. My question is a bit of like around a broader theme of community engaged research. And I was wondering, you've already kind of referenced it throughout the presentation, and I was wondering if you could maybe underscore a couple of pieces of advice, for lack of a better phrase, that you would offer to those of us who are interested in sort of starting, like what were some helpful entry points to starting, to sort of bring in that lens of community engaged research. And also if you could comment on what are some, I guess, risks or challenges of maybe being perceived as you're kind of dropping into a space, right? And doing some research with them. Yeah, thank you.
That's a wonderful question. Thank you so much. So first is, may not be an easy answer to accept, but first is, and I am really grateful you gave us the chance to talk about this, first is relationship building, but also relationship building and connections. But I will say that they need to be done not because one is applying for a grant, not because this is something, I mean, that is the thing. And I like to tell my students who are just behind me that the same skills that go for relationships in other parts of our lives also go true for academics or for research, which is that build relationships, dialogue, listening, being generosity, those things come in. And so I am always, I always like to stress that our lab is pretty recent. But our community is not, because it is really on the foundation of my wonderful, wonderful colleagues and our students and other groups linked to the Culinary Research Center, particularly, that these relationships came about. So in 2020, when we reached out for Feeding the City project and for the funding that allowed us to start off, it's not that we were reaching out to people like, these were people who we had worked with and usually with no money. So lots of, kind of sharing food and talking and so on. But it was not done with any, and we've always transparent. We basically had no funding. Many of us started as humanities scholars, but it was about relationship building. It was really about highlighting in our classes, what these amazing stakeholders were doing. And then when we did come to a position where we're assembling research projects, applying for funding, and so the same. And so it's really about relationship building. But again, if it is directed only towards applying for a particular grant or a publication, I will say that it is not going to work. And I recently had a request, and I absolutely respect the, context in which it came from, but somebody had asked to be introduced to some of our collaborators and needed it like really quickly. And I was like, well, I can make the introduction, but that building that relationship takes time, and it is not a good start to basically be asking for something. I mean, the relationship needs to come first, right? And those, I would say, the pitfalls. And one of the big critiques, not just me, in fact, it's one of our community collaborators, Access Alliance, in their own amazing research reports have highlighted it, the parasitic nature of much academic research, that people are swooping in, doing a project and leaving. And, and very often, sadly, there is no dialogue, there's no connection after that. And that is something communities do resent. And that is something which, again, I think we should be very aware of.
And just to add to Joe's advice about relationship building. I mean, relationship is at the core of this podcast project. So we had, pre-existing relationships with all of the collaborators that we're working with and that we're featuring with. Sometimes we meet new collaborators through the network. So that was the case with Tiago, and now we're building something from there. That's pretty recent. But for the most part, to answer your question about entry points, Joe, I know, sometimes in pre-COVID times, but inviting a community collaborator to your class with an honorarium, right, to talk to your class, to help as an entry point, and then to build that relationship is a really useful, approach. As well, during the COVID-19 pandemic itself, when we were all working remotely, Joe and I were regularly attending meetings of the Scarborough Food Network. So this was a grassroots network that was had been organized loosely in Scarborough several years ago, and they were convening monthly and building something more durable, which really became a necessity during the pandemic. So there were organizations, community organizations, and people as well, residents who would attend these meetings online and share what they're doing. It was a great opportunity for them to share their knowledge and build out that network. And Joe and I attended every month. We made sure that there was somebody, from our team who could always be there. And from there, we actually were able to dedicate resources to support the Scarborough Food Network so that they can continue running it. And it's flourished since then. So, showing up regularly, offering to support regularly within, the resources that you have and that you can bring as a researcher is really, really key.
If I can actually go back there, I mentioned our postdoc Noah and our former RAs, Sebastian, for instance. They were the ones who worked with our team. We used a bit of our funding to actually set up the digital infrastructure for the Scarborough Food Network. And again, at that time, they did not even have the capacity for a Zoom meeting, which is more than the free 45 minutes. So for 3 years, we paid for the website to be set up. We supported the digital running of the network. And now it's wonderful because the network, the constituent organizations are running it itself. And it is actually our own alumni who is now the honorary president of the network. But that is, again, an example. So it didn't cost us very much. It was time and labor, but also the resources that we already have. We are privileged, especially in universities, and we can use a bit of that privilege. And I tell people I spend a lot of my time writing in for small and big grants at the university because all of that allows us. And again, I will say my cell phone number, my WhatsApp number are there. I have got sometimes, requests at midnight because an organization is applying for the kind of grants, for instance, CIC has mentioned. And we write letters of support because all of that is part of that same amazing collaboration and relationship that we've built with these constituent bodies.
Thank you very much for that thorough response. So we have about a few minutes left. So are there any other questions on the call before we ask maybe one or two more questions that we've got written down? Okay, so another question, I think I see a question in the chat, possibly.
Well, that's a very big question.
Maybe we'll go for a more target question. So
I can answer that very quickly.
Sure.
So as somebody who used to be a college teacher in the Global South, and here in the Global North now, I can tell you a big thing that we have in the existing education system, whether it be school or college, is that, again, perhaps people don't realize it, the pretty big privilege of actually something that professors and school teachers get to frame their own syllabi here, which is not a flexibility that I had as a college teacher in the Global South, at least where I studied or where I taught. And that is, again, in our existing education system at different levels. If you're an educator, if you're a student, one has the opportunity to bring in community-based research and work. Thank you, Lynn. And Lynn is, again, one of our wonderful collaborators, another project from OCAD University.
So maybe if we have time for one more question, I'm just wondering if there were any key takeaways you had from all the interviews you took, or points in common that you felt from all the experiences that were shared with you during these podcasts and interviews.
I think one of the things we learned, and this is really, we are going in the different, directions, is where we are really now examining different types of sustainable transitions, the importance of both the local and the global, the importance of the specific local solutions that are being developed, the failures, the challenges, but also the successes. And again, the importance of comparing, collating, putting those together. And that is a big role for the university and for academics and researchers, because the grassroots stakeholders in particular do not have the capacity to do it. And that is where universities can play a huge role. And I would absolutely give a shout out here to the Office of the Vice Principal Research at UTSC and to other units, the Office of International Research at U of T, the School of Cities, because they make it possible for us to do this work. And we can do it within our classes. We can do it. Students do research, especially at the University of Toronto. The university supports those projects very generously. I have an entire class of young people who are doing independent research projects on different aspects here. And so we all have the capacity to do it.
Well, I guess that brings us to the end of Knowledge Cafe for today. Thank you so much, Jackie and Joe, for a very insightful presentation. It was so interesting to hear about all these different experiences you've learned from and all the interviews you've had. So we welcome everyone to attend next month's Knowledge Cafe. Check the link that Austin sent as well to learn about more events that the School of Cities is putting on. And round of applause for Jackie and Joe again. Thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting us.
Have a good rest of the day, everyone.